So you know where the iron comes from, but now we need a way to get the iron out of the ore. And in order to do that, we're going to have to melt our iron ore. That's going to require a fire, a very, very hot fire, and that's going to require fuel. There are many things we could use as a fuel. Anything that's rich in carbon, the element carbon, could be used as a fuel source. Trees are rich in carbon, and they will burn, as you know. But trees have impurities in them, sort of like the iron ore did. And these impurities make trees less than an ideal fuel. There's a lot of water, for example, in a tree. That's okay though. We can actually do something to trees to turn them into a better fuel. We can turn them into charcoal. Charcoal is just wood that has been baked in a kiln. If you bake it in a kiln long enough, you drive off the water and many of the other impurities, and you're left with just the carbon. And this will now burn better. A pound of charcoal burns much better than a pound of regular wood will. It's a good fuel source, but there are even better fuel sources. These better fuel sources are actually fossils, rocks that come from deep within the earth. And they're made from trees, but not trees that grew recently. We're talking about trees that lived and died millions of years ago. In this case, here in Pennsylvania, the coal that we find comes from plants that died about 300 million years ago. Back then, this part of the world was very different. If you were in this part of the world back then, you would have been in a warm tropical swamp. And in these warm tropical swamps, trees would have grown and lived and died. And when they died, they'd fall over in that swamp. And they'd sink into the slime, and they wouldn't really decompose. More trees would end up growing on top of them, and they would eventually die. And more trees would grow on top of that. And eventually, very deep layers of dead, partially rotten vegetation would be formed. And we call this peat. Peat is a good fuel source. It's compressed wood. But if you leave peat in the ground long enough, as it gets buried even deeper under the earth, the forces of heat and pressure over time compress that wood, compress that peat into denser and denser and purer forms of carbon that are fossils. These are no longer plants. These are rocks and minerals in the ground. With enough heat, time, and pressure, that peat becomes lignite coal, which burns even better than the peat did. With even more heat, time, and pressure, lignite coal can eventually become bituminous coal, which is the most common coal in the world. It's the most widely used coal in the world even today. It's a good fuel source, but there's an even better one. With even more heat, time, and pressure, bituminous coal will eventually become anthracite coal. Anthracite coal is almost pure carbon. It can be up to 96 to 98% carbon. It's a very dense, energy-rich fuel source, but this is a rock that came from trees. It's just been compressed. It's been changed by the forces of heat, time, and pressure. That's very important to understand, not just for how coal forms, but for understanding the history of the Earth itself. Many things that we find on the Earth were sculpted by the forces of heat, time, and pressure. Because this rock formed deep underground, in some cases, it's still deep underground. And some people had the very dangerous, difficult job of going into mines to extract this coal. Here you can see workers doing this. This was not a very safe job. It was not a comfortable job, but it was an important job because coal is what powered the early American Industrial Revolution.